great pleasure and an honor to be here and to give the Bogitsh Lecture. It's not going to be a rehash of what I did in the Gifford Lectures, but if you'd like to read that book, you can get piled higher and deeper, as they say. But I will develop some of the themes and ideas that were in the Gifford Lectures, and I want to tell you what a marvelous experience that was. It's commonly said that morality doesn't really need to be grounded in theology, and I think that's true. That's part of our Enlightenment heritage. It's certainly possible for a person to be moral without being religious and without professing a religion. One doesn't have to believe in God to be a moral person. I think that's a point that was settled a long time ago for thinking people. There is, in fact, a certain forthright courage in standing up for one's morality without support from divine backup, without cheering choruses of angels, without a big apotheosis like we see at the climax of Gounod's Faust, for example. A heroic individual standing up for human values without backing of religion, bravely opposing familiar nostrums and dogmas of conventional morality and belief, perhaps alone, perhaps even persecuted in Promethean splendor. That point deserves to be granted. However, the postures celebrated in those tones are not always as upright and forthright as they're cracked up to be. Sometimes what's presented as a brave new morality is not so life-affirming. I can't help thinking of Garrett Hardin's secular morality here, his readiness to jettison much of the world's population, typically of races other than his own, in order to preserve the worthier and more disciplined members of the surviving community of Lifeboat Earth, as he and his followers put it. What's offered as practical and even scientifically sanctioned new moralities are often just the same old nastiness that we're familiar with from the past, dressed up in some new garb. Discontent with old gods, we can learn, is often merely a subterfuge cloaking seamy notions of eugenics or genocide, dressed up in scientific garb, racism or class struggle and so forth. We've seen that in our own lifetimes in the genocide in Cambodia, Srebrenica, Mao, China, Stalin's Soviet Union, and its ill-gotten empire. Science, we're sometimes told, is neutral morally. I don't believe that that's so, but it's easy to mask some of the values that scientists live by. The moral passion of inquiry, the dedication to truth, the joy of discovery, the sense of order and rightness and generosity that a scientist might see in the order of nature, the goodness that one might discover, although science doesn't always provide the vocabulary to express that. Steven Weinberg, a very prominent cosmologist, physicist, a leading thinker of our day, is not atypical in offering what starts out sounding like a neutral verdict coming from the mouth of science, a neutral verdict on the cosmos, but then swings towards dismissal. And I quote briefly from his words. He says, "It is almost irresistible for humans to believe that human life is not just a farcical outcome of a chain of accidents. It's very hard for us to realize that Earth is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." What I find most striking in those remarks, coming from a scientist whose mathematical capabilities far outstrip my own, is the weak logic of his reasoning, an immense equivocation that he's trying to straddle, a yawning non sequitur which he seeks to vault. he moves from the small to the insignificant as though he hasn't really changed the subject at all. He moves from randomness, which is often a sign of order, all the way to farce, from risk and hazard to pointlessness. Those are non sequiturs. Surely one can't be disappointed unless there's something that one has expected. And the very notion of hostility, where he talks about the hostile universe, the very notion of hostility presupposes that there's something worth preserving. So the values that he's denying, the emptiness that he thinks he sees all around us in the cosmos, and he's using his authority as a scientist to speak about it, turns out to be fraught with values. He appeals to our concern for human helplessness and vulnerability, and then he wants to turn that concern into a rejection of reality. There's a couple of chairs over here. Please, gentlemen, don't be shy. It's okay. So does science remain the dispassionate observer in a remark like that, which is not atypical? Or has scientism leapt onto the court and joined the game, which it's at the same time offering to cancel, by calling everything a farce, meaningless not just in the sense that nature contains no hidden codes, but in the more familiar sense that seems to license anything at all? It's probably true that our appetite for meaning cannot be overcome any more than the search for beauty can, or the love of kindness, or the joy of discovery. But such motives can be repressed, and I think they're repressed more radically, more swiftly, perhaps, and more fully by ridicule than they are by threats of violence. Yet we do seek meaning, and to the embarrassment of the naysayers, we often find it, sometimes where we least expected it. The moral realm is one rich vein where meaning can be found. It was found by Socrates, by Jesus, by Moses, by Gandhi, by Mother Teresa, by Father Damien, who devoted his life to the leper colony in Kalaupapa, by Levinas and Confucius. They found meaning amidst the challenges of the human condition. Remember, Confucius's philosophy comes from the period of the warring states in China, when there was anarchy. The same is true of the Book of Judges, a book that reflects an attempt to grasp meaning in the heart of an anarchic situation. The discoveries in morals by intellectuals and spiritual and moral leaders like those encourage others to keep up the search despite the misprisions of less insightful followers, just as the discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo, Lavoisier and Newton, Darwin, Mendel and Einstein and Planck have encouraged others to pursue the search for truth in the natural order. My question today is not whether God is a necessary moral postulate. Diverse gods are often invoked to prop up all sorts of moral and pseudo-moral notions. But moralities, I think, can be measured by the gods they serve. And in the same way, theologies meet their measure in the morals they espouse. Theologies meet their measure in the morals they espouse. We can read in the Good Book, Part 2, that the way to judge the inmost intentions of our fellow humans is the same way we judge trees in an orchard, by their fruits. Spinoza was once asked by his landlady if she could attain salvation in her faith. He didn't ask her for the theological details of her faith. He said, "Does your faith teach you charity and justice? If so, you can be saved in that faith." A wonderful answer, tuned to the ear of the hearer. The idea that our gods are judged by the actions they inspire was central in the message of Israel's ancient prophets when they invade against the orgiastic blood cult of Canaan with its ritual sacrifice of beloved offspring. And I can tell you, parenthetically, that at one point there was an attempt to sacrifice, substitute children. They bought children to sacrifice instead of their own favorites, and that was rejected by the gods, and they had to go back penitently and offer the children they really cared about. The prophets of Israel inveighed against gods that would make such a demand. And similarly, the gods of Egypt get judged, again, in the Hebrew Bible, because there you had a culture that was, where the love of life, which is so visible in what we have of Egyptian ideas, was buried under a preoccupation with the afterlife and with death, which was the shadow of the afterlife. Life itself became a kind of shadow in that environment, and the Bible says, God says in the Bible, don't follow the path of the Egyptians, don't walk in the ways of the Egyptians, walk in my way, which is a way of life. Notice the contrast, a way of life, not a way of death and afterlife, and the gods of the Egyptians are being judged there. I see 7 ways in which monotheism enriches morals, and those are the themes I'd like to focus on today. And you'll see those same 7 themes in the book version of the Gifford Lectures, Love Thy Neighbor as Thyself, but I'm going to, as I say, I'm not going to parrot my own book. That would be too boring. Let me name the 7 ways, and then we'll see what we have time to do with them. The first involves love, the second involves absoluteness, the third involves, let me get them in order, stability, the fourth, universality, the fifth, the open-endedness of the quest, the sixth, the inwardness of it, the seventh, imitatio Dei, the endeavor to become as godlike as we possibly can, an ideal which is held forth both biblically and in Plato, where Plato has the lesson taught that our task in life is to become as like the divine as humanly possible, echoing with the commandment in Leviticus, where people are commanded to become holy because God is holy. First of all, with regard to love, I think that's an important contribution of the idea of God in ethics. If you look at a lot of ethical thinkers and political thinkers, they're very concerned about equality, and they don't necessarily recognize that equality by itself is just a formal virtue. It doesn't really tell you how others should be treated. The nasty example that I could mention is the Marquis de Sade, who says that he's willing to be equally cruel to anyone, and he's willing to subject himself to the same cruelties that he has imposed on others. It's a parody of the ideal of equality. You get a gentler version of it in Shaw's Pygmalion, where Professor Higgins, you remember the scene where Professor Higgins says, well, I treat everyone the same, and the admonition that he gets is, you treat a flower girl the same as a duchess, and a duchess the same as a flower girl, but the difference between you and Colonel Pickering is that when you treat a duchess, you treat her like a flower girl, and when she treats a flower, Colonel Pickering treats a flower girl, he treats her like a duchess. There's a directionality in equality which isn't captured in the equal sign. And what that directionality is about is the substantive deserts of persons as persons, of human beings as human beings. There's something of positive worth. There's something of dignity and value in a human being. That's the basis of the claim to liberty, and that's the basis of the claim to equality. In fact, it's not just treating people the same, it's treating people properly as human beings. That's a biblical theme, and it's articulated in a very interesting way biblically through the Hebrew value of chesed. Chesed, usually translated as loving kindness. It corresponds to the Chinese virtue of Ren, which is, if you're writing notes, Jen, Don't ask me why. The idea of loving kindness is a kind of very special relationship that individuals are supposed to have with each other and that individuals have with God. God shows grace even though we don't deserve it. And chesed is well translated as grace or favor. We're supposed to show that same generosity and grace to one another. One of the things that I've tried to do in some of my ethical writings is connect that idea of what people deserve, the grace with which we should respond to one another, the love and care and concern that we should show one another. I've tried to connect that with Spinoza's idea of the conatus. I think that, you know how Spinoza, some of you know how Spinoza connects, Spinoza identifies the essence of a thing, the reality of a thing, not with its flat and static nature, but with its striving and its program and its desires and intentions. That's what I think we have to recognize in all things, especially in living things, and even more so in persons, in human beings. The idea of special worth, special desert, the idea of rights, which are deserts on a platform, on a plateau, these are pointers to God. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about not trying to derive one's morality from divine commands is that it obviates the need to argue in a circle and derive one's idea of God from what one thinks about morality. Think of those special values that we cherish or ought to cherish in one another as pointers to divinity, and you'll see a small glimmer of what's meant when it says in the book of Genesis that human beings are created in the divine image. That brings me to the idea of absoluteness. One of the things that thinking of morals in religious terms gives us is the notion that morals are not so easily compromised. In my theory about morals, I have these deserts which apply to all things, not just animals and plants, but even echo niches and monuments of nature and culture. But on this high plateau for subjects, persons, whether they're human or in some other galaxy, even if they're not human, if they're persons, if they're subjects, they're entitled to very special treatment. But part of that special treatment is the idea of rights. Rights are not relative. Rights are not compromisable. A famous philosopher says that rights are trumps. Those of you who play bridge will appreciate that imagery. Rights are trumps. If I look at the philosophy of John Rawls, who is widely respected as one of the great moral teachers of the 20th century, I find that Rawls wants to take rights very seriously. He wants to put rights on a platform above mere entitlements. And at the same time, he's very worried that his colleagues at Harvard might accuse him of thinking that there was something a priori, that was something unchangeable, that was something absolute. One has to worry, you know, the word absolute is used as a tag to label people who believe that there are moral truths and moral realities, and they're called absolutists as if to say that they were totalitarians. Rawls is very worried, and so he's got the great philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine looking over his shoulder and saying, look, even logical truths belong to a network of possibilities which might have to be compromised in various ways. And Rawls makes a gesture of deference in that direction and says, well, the finest equilibrium that we can reach by using our reason is liable to be upset on further examination by conditions which should be imposed on the contractual situation in which we engage, and by particular cases which may lead us to revise our judgments. So there, in the interest of fallibilism, in the interest of not sounding dogmatic about morals, he takes the notion of rights down off its pedestal a notch and says, well, maybe there are conditions where they can be compromised. Maybe there are. And those are the conditions where you need the notion of absolute right and wrong to stand very, very strong, or you're going to lose it all. Because, of course, it's only in the issues where they're liable to be compromised that they're really in jeopardy. Otherwise, we just go along and take everything for granted and everything is fine. That notion of fallibilism, that notion of being flexible, I think monotheism in particular and religion in general get a bad name for being unwavering, but this is an area where one needs to be unwavering, and this is one of the contributions of the idea of God to morals, where we say, look, rights cannot be compromised. There's a link, I think, an implicit connection between the idea of the divine and the idea of morals, an implicit appeal when people uphold the idea of rights or the idea of moral objectivity or the idea of moral realism. It has various names. When people uphold that and they say, look, I can believe in these things even if I don't believe in God, I think they're making an implicit appeal to the idea of God. I think they're implicitly pointing to the idea of God. This is not an original idea on my part. It's something that Plato pointed out long ago when he noticed that when you do mathematics, you're appealing to the idea of unity, because all your ability to count depends on the idea of unity. And the idea of unity, whether you recognize it or not, makes implicit appeal to the notion of an absolute one. There couldn't be any relative one unless there were an absolute one. And in a similar way, there couldn't be a relative good unless there were an absolute good. And there couldn't be rights unless there was some reason why those rights cannot be compromised. So we need to choose our gods very carefully. The ground is still littered with the shards of various idols, mistaken notions of the absolute. Religion, if it gathers the values and focuses our concerns, which I think is what the function of religion really is hardly morally or politically neutral. And efforts to neuter it, I think, are misguided and sure to fail, since people will always have their ideals and always assign transcendent value to some of them. The key is to choose those values well and wisely. And that's what I mean by choosing your gods wisely. Stability. Stability is a corollary of absoluteness. Tradition generates an ethos, a body of law, habits of mind. We can see that in Genesis, where God says that he's confident in Abraham, because he knows that Abraham will raise his children properly. He knows that Abraham will see to it that his offspring and all his followers will preserve God's way in living justly and establishing justice. The ethos, the law, the custom, all reinforce one another. And they can anchor a society, affording not just means of enduring, but a purpose that makes it worthwhile to endure. Because after all, a society that doesn't have a sense of purpose and a sense of ideals, what's the point of bothering keeping it going? It's not true, I think, that just any system of rules, if consistent, can be made just. You need that material component in it. Again, you need that commitment to being, that commitment to reality, that commitment to personhood above all. That's where the content of morals comes from, and not just the form. My fourth theme was universality. Customs may differ. Sophists like to make a big deal out of that. Customs do differ. but morals is very constant. Think about the different ways. I once read an anthropological essay about Navin. It's a kind of ritualized way in which a certain tribal culture expresses shame and regret. The manner in which this is done is very extreme, highly ritualized. The idea that you've insulted somebody that you shouldn't have insulted, that's not so culture-bound. That's rather universal. The idea that people have feelings, caring for everyone, caring about everyone, avoiding stereotypes, the Talmudic idea of avoiding nicknames. The existentialists used to say that nicknames are a way of notionally destroying another person, reducing that person to nullity or to something very small. Stereotypes are worse in that regard, of course. One of the things that I think is very interesting about the Bible, and where you can see the idea of the one God contributing massively to ethics, is in what I like to call the moral non sequitur. What's the moral non sequitur? You got a good example of it when God has just about destroyed everything in the flood of Noah, and then God says, you know, I see that human beings are really not so hot. They're really not so great. The inclination that they have is evil from their youth. Therefore, I'm never going to do this again. That's what I call a moral non sequitur. God is going to bear with us, right? You'd think that the inference would be, okay, I've had it, you guys are through. And the inference is just the opposite. That moral non sequitur takes a very interesting form in the same piece of logic, the same odd piece of quirky logic, occurs in a biblical commandment. It's a biblical commandment that you shouldn't hate Egyptians. And the reason given, you shouldn't hate them, you shouldn't oppress them, you shouldn't disparage them. It's said a couple of different ways. The reason it's given is because you were slaves there. You were slaves there. And you'd think that exactly the opposite inference could be drawn. Well, why not say you were slaves there, therefore sock it to them? And it has exactly the opposite. What makes the difference? What makes the logic go through in a piece of reasoning like that, which is so quirky and so counterintuitive, so unexpected? What makes the logic go through is, one could say, a sense of empathy. It says, don't oppress the slave. You know the heart of a slave. You've been there. You've been through that experience. Remember it. Partly empathy, but it's more than empathy. Empathy, as Kant and other great moralists have pointed out, is an emotional, psychological kind of response. They think it's grounded in our mirror neurons and, has its counterparts in higher animals, certainly in primates and some other higher animals too. But you know the funny thing about those emotional responses, they're very reversible. They're very contingent. You can feel a twinge when you see somebody suffering, and that twinge can be turned into concern, or it can be concerned into distancing, or the worst kind of distancing, it can be turned into cruelty, where one steels oneself against sharing in that suffering by negating the person who's undergoing that suffering, saying, we're not like them, I'm not like them, and making oneself not like them by pushing them down further. The moral nexus at the heart of the reasoning, the unusual, quirky reasoning, the moral nexus that drives that inference is a regard for those special deserts that human beings have, that other creatures have too. It's the basis of ethical formulations. the very basic formulation, love thy neighbor as thyself, which is a generalized version of don't hate the Egyptian. Look out for the widow and the orphan. Consider them, champion their cause, take care of them. Broadening it out, you shouldn't vex or wrong the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That moral nexus which drives all that reasoning, I don't want to say it's grounded in the idea of God. You could go that way. I want to say it points to the idea of God. It tells you something about what goes beyond self-interest, what goes beyond group interest, what goes beyond the automatic response, and gets you into a realm where you can say that human beings have higher concerns, concerns with love and care, concerns that we think we share with God. The fifth point is a point about the open-endedness of the moral obligation. The great 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about that. He talks about what sounds like empathy at first. He talks about it's okay, she's fine. That's a little Ravital. He talks about the human face and the emotional response we have to the human face, and it's almost on the level of talking about empathy as a physiological response. And I'm sure you all know cheapo artists like Margaret Keane, who used to do kitschy paintings of little children with very large eyes. You've seen those. And of course, they push our buttons. The reason they're kitschy is because they push our buttons and they evoke a response even though we know better. It starts out sounding like empathy when Levinas makes his point, but it goes far, far beyond empathy when he says that it starts out with the face. What the face says if it speaks is don't kill me, but it goes much further than that, of course. The demands that the face of another human being makes upon us are infinite. And when we say that, we see that face as the image of God again, making infinite demands on us, opening up a universe to us. There's an interesting passage, I mentioned it this morning over at the medical school, of how the Jewish texts interpret what was wrong with Sodom, as we call it, Sodom. And I'll give you a hint, it wasn't about what's called sodomy in English. That was the least of their problems. The ethos of Sodom, according to the rabbinic sources, the ethos of Sodom, which they call Midat Sodom, was what's mine is mine and what's thine is thine. It sounds like Justinian's code. It sounds like perfectly good, mine is mine, thine is thine. That is not Midat Chasidim. That is not the ethos of generosity and graciousness and kindness and love, which is supposed to be extended even to the stranger, even to your enemies. That asks a lot. It asks a lot. I'm thinking of a recent book by my friend Yoram Chazoni, and the book has been controversial already. I guess that's good. Sell a few more copies. Chazoni makes the point that the Bible is not about obedience and conformity. The big heroes in the Bible are people who go off by themselves like Moses did and become shepherds and don't live in an urban society and don't cultivate the ground and don't keep the rules. Maybe sometimes they need to make the rules. Sometimes maybe new rules are needed. Standing up on your own in that sense, standing up against the Nazis rather than going along with them, that's a kind of moral heroism. And that's part of what Levinas was getting at when he spoke of the infinite demand made by another human face. It starts out very small and very modest, but it doesn't confine itself because the human face is the image of God. Inwardness. Inwardness has to do with conscience. Conscience, again, can be treated reductively. I teach a lot of Darwin in my spare time here at Vanderbilt, and Darwin wants to derive moral ideas from group social instincts, herd instinct or pack instinct. He thinks that he can draw a continuum where you have only a difference of degree and not a difference of kind between moral concerns and what it is that animals feel when they have to go with the flow or go with the group. I think there is a difference of kind. Consciousness is not just about guilt. Consciousness is not, as Spinoza explained, is not particularly about regret. Conscience is concern. Conscience is love. It's about caring, which goes far beyond empathy. It means caring for the other for his own sake, not because I identify with him. He might be very different. It's in spite of those differences that I care about him. And ethics is not just about others. It opens a path to self-improvement. I once read in the works of a very famous 20th century ethical philosopher that ethics is about how you treat other people. And I'm thinking, my God, she's leaving out the heart of it. Ethics begins with how you cultivate yourself. If you don't have that self, you're not going to be able to do much for other people, and you're not going to be able to have the concern for other people. Yeah, we're social beings, all right, but we're not social constructs. We have to be able to know what it is to be human and to develop our own internal strengths, our own internal understanding, our own internal, identity, and that gives us the base from which we reach out to others and the strength with which to do it. The seventh point, and the final one, is the one I mentioned, Imitatio Dei. Leviticus, as I told you, tells us that our task is to become holy, because God is holy. And it seems a paradoxical sort of task, if not an infinite demand. Holy, as I read the Bible, means transcendent. How do you become transcendent? And if you're supposed to be like God, isn't God sort of infinite? How do you get to that point? Plato, as I mentioned, says something similar. Plato says that our task is to become as like to God as humanly possible. It's a nice qualification, as humanly possible. But what does it mean to become like the divine? It means to rise beyond our own limitations. It means that our lives and our task are not limited to what we might assume are our capabilities. It means that we need to grow intellectually, morally, spiritually. One of the nice things about Maimonides, by the way, I'm doing a lot of work on Maimonides now, as some of you know. Maimonides is a very creative reader of Scripture and a very creative reader of rabbinic texts as well. When the rabbis read that text about you shall become holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy, and they're the big authorities that he's supposed to be relying on, they say, what it means is, of course it's paradoxical, we can't really become like God, but what it means is, as God clothes the naked, so you should clothe the naked. As God feeds the hungry, so you should feed the hungry. Classic texts in rabbinic literature, often repeated. Maimonides does a very creative move with that. He accepts the moral interpretation and he enlarges it with an intellectual interpretation as well. That's his own original contribution. That is, becoming like God also means knowing God. And his idea of how you know God, I mentioned this morning, is by knowing nature as God's work. Not reductively the way Weinberg did, and it's all a farce, it's all meaningless. knowing nature as an expression of grace, knowing nature as an expression of wisdom, knowing nature as an expression of the divine. You know, Picasso once said that an ordinary person wants to draw the sun, and he makes a yellow spot on a paper. An artist makes a yellow spot on a paper and makes the sun. Looking at the world with the kind of eyes that Maimonides is talking about, and by the way, if we're being very ecumenical here, Al-Ghazali says something similar, the great Muslim theologian that was Maimonides' predecessor. Looking at the world with the kind of eyes that Maimonides advises us to look at it means looking at it in a non-neutral, non-dismissive way, looking at it with the eyes of love, looking at it for the values that it contains, and discovering the beauty and the truth and the goodness which we can glean from that experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you take a few questions right up to the
I could take as many questions as people can dish out, and it'll be my pleasure. Go ahead.
Lenn, thank you very much. This was a tour de force, and you've touched upon so many points that are worthy of further exploration. I'm not quite sure where I should start. So I think I'm going to start with your beginning, okay, and that is Steven Weinberg.
Yeah.
And your reading of Steven Weinberg's characterization of the universe as being, maybe even life in the universe, as being farcical. How did this all come about? And I'm wondering whether it would be useful if we were to look at the role of the author writing for an audience and expecting certain kinds of reactions, which you did throughout your talk, and you cited others and how one should react. I ultimately want to end up by asking the question, because it is so important to what Weinberg is fascinated by, which is, so how do we make sense out of the universe which we as humans inhabit? We humans have the capacity to rise to what we like to think is an extraordinary kind of ability, to rise to consciousness. And out of this consciousness, we can develop a sense of conscience, which is where you ended up toward the end. I am struck by the symbolic choice of 7 in your enumeration. And I'm going to focus in on number 5, the essence of the divine, and the transition from, it's not the essence of the divine, but it's the transcendence of the earthly to that 5th element, which is, of course, love. But you added, as in that slot number 5, openness, open-ended search.
Yes.
So my question is, how do we get to know the self, and how can we know Yahweh?
Okay.
Because I think we're trying to line them up somehow.
I'm with you. It's a tall order, of course, which I would expect less from John McCarthy. Transcendence is something that's a capability for us. What Weinberg is doing in the interest of rhetoric, let's say, is dismissing even the enterprise that he himself is engaged in. That is, look, if it's all a farce, why do science? Why do cosmology? Why try and find out the secrets of the universe and not only find them out, but reduce them all to one big formula, one unifying law, one very satisfying and beautiful, elegant set of equations? Why try and be the best scientist there is, or the best scientist you can be. And Weinberg is widely regarded as, some people think he is the best, one of the best. He's undermining that enterprise himself. And you know why he's doing it? Because if he were to admit what it's premised upon, it would unravel his whole dismissive posture. He's got values there. And the values, in fact, are predicated on notions of the absolute. How do we get to know God? After all, if God is infinite, how do we approach the infinite? That's the essence of your question. Let me put it to you, to start out with science. Science gets nowhere. Science can't begin without positing the infinite. How so? Think about the way the scientist presumes the constancy of nature, the constancy of natural laws and principles. The scientist doesn't just say nature behaves this way in all the observed cases. That doesn't give you science at all. Science has got to be saying, not only in the observed cases, but in the unobserved cases. That's how you go. That's how you go from Newton to the explanation of planetary motion and the derivation of Kepler's laws. And that's how you go. How Kant went to the understanding of what galaxies are, and you extrapolate. You say these aren't just things that happen to be the case. These are things that have to be the case. They're universally so. The laws of nature has a constancy to them, and that constancy by God is infinite. It extends far beyond our ken. It extends far beyond our observations or our data set. And if you don't believe that, you can't do science. Well, we've got the infinite right before us, right inside us. We've got, the same as we've got unity. I used the example of unity because it was Plato's example, right? That we presuppose unity when we take the first step in mathematics. Well, I quote Maimonides again. He says, you know, if you're going to do theology, you should do a little mathematics. He doesn't say it in quite so modest a way. He's a medieval guy. If you're going to do theology, you should do mathematics. If you study the conic sections of Apollonius, you find that there's a conic section which is a curve that can approach ever closer to a line. And the further you extend it, the closer it gets. And we can prove that. And you can extend it to infinity and it'll never touch that line. It'll always get closer, it'll never touch that line. It's what we call an asymptotic approach, right? That's what it's like to try and know God. Yes, God is transcendent, and that doesn't mean out of reach. And part of my burden today was to say, you know, Tolstoy wrote a book with this title, taken from, the Good Book Part 2. The kingdom of God is within you. Look inside yourself. Or better yet, look in the face of your fellow human being. You won't see God there. Some of the Sufis tried to do that. They only got in because of all kinds of illicit problems that the church is still suffering from. But you won't see God there, right? But you'll see a pointer, you'll see a hint, you'll see an image. And it's not the image of a face. One of the things I like to point out, when it says about the image of God in the book of Genesis, what does it say? Male and female in the image of God. Interesting, huh? That's a hint of two things. One is that the sexes are equal, relative to God. And the other, that we're not talking about a physical image. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a moral image. And what is a moral image? A moral image is one that points in the direction of transcendence because of that open-endedness that you opened your question with. Let me take another one. Yeah?
So, I'm concerned about the idea of unity and morality, and in particular, when we're talking about the biblical text, what do you do when God, or Jesus, seems to be depicted as immoral? You were talking about judges, you were talking about sacrificing children, and thinking about the binding of Isaac. I mean, what do you...
Well, if you want to read about the binding of Isaac,
that's not unity.
yeah. If you want to read about the binding of Isaac, I've got a big long chapter about it in my book, God of Abraham, and it's a very unusual book because you can't normally sign Rembrandt to do your cover art for you, but we were able to get it, and I really recommend you read that chapter. And I will tell you the Kitzur, as we say, in a nutshell, that the binding of Isaac, as I read the story, which is, of course, correctly, the binding of Isaac was a way of showing how God revealed himself to be the God who does not demand sacrifices. That's why the mountain is called Mount Moriah. That's why Abraham's attempted evasion, when Isaac says, I see the fire, but where's the wood, where's the lamb? And he says, in your translation, it might say God will provide the lamb. What does it really say? God will see to the lamb. That's important because that word "will see to" comes back as in a play on words, where God not only provides the lamb, but God reveals himself, and we're told that this is the place where God revealed himself, and the name of the mountain is Mount Moriah, which means the place where that theophany occurred, the place of the theophany, the place of that vision, that realization. What was the big realization? The best God doesn't demand the best sacrifice. That again might seem a little counterintuitive, but there you are. The moral reasoning is driving the inference, not the notion that if it's the highest, it must demand the worst. That if it's the absolute. I'm working on something now where I'm inveighing against Rudolf Otto's overly influential interpretation of holiness as connected with violence and again, too neutral. At best, it's too neutral. It's also too romantic, fascinated instead of repelled by the violence. When I said you've got to choose your gods, I really meant it. I really meant it very, very, very much. So I hope that's an answer to your question. And do read that opening chapter of God of Abraham, because I go through the romantic and the Kierkegaardian interpretation of that, which I think you can tell from what I said already, I think very wrong-headed. Yeah. Who else? Yes, sir.
I'm not sure how to state this because I don't know the kind of things you do.
I probably don't know the kind of things you do either.
I wonder why your concept of love is couched, I think, primarily in Christianity and Judaism. And I presume that different religions interpret love in different ways. Certainly religions have loved by killing people, and genocide in certain cases, and
We're going to show them that we love them by killing them. I haven't come across that one.
well, I think that history has shown that love can be expressed in converting others to perhaps your belief system. And if they don't want to willingly, that they may be converted through various kinds of violence.
And we're to save their soul.
But I'm wondering why the love that you're talking about, that seems in humanity's history to have very different meanings than what you talk about in terms of other religions, and the same thing with God, that if we're trying to perfect ourselves to love as God, what happens to, I mean, we're as Christians or Jews, in the history of time, we're such a small faction of humanity's history that has been allowed to, for various survival of the fittest, the history of mankind has had all kinds of innocence, perhaps babies die, and I'm just trying to get a larger context as to why you.
Let me try and tackle it, if I may. You're raising important questions about cross-cultural differences. I'm going to stick with one of the things I said in the talk, which is that customs may differ, but morality doesn't. I don't think that love has different meanings in different cultures. I think that love is about affirmation and support. I think in terms of intersubjectivity, love is about recognizing the personhood of the other and appreciating the other as a person. Why did I talk primarily in Jewish and Christian terms? Partly because I know the Jewish text the best, and partly because my audience has a lot of Christians in it. I did mention a couple of Chinese terms because I spent 25 years in Hawaii, and you can't be a member of the philosophy department at the University of Hawaii without picking up a little by osmosis. But the fact of the matter is that it's very easy to do nasty things in the name of love. I'm not here to endorse the Spanish Inquisition, and I'm sure some of those guys were very sincere. I don't really care how sincere they were. I want to make a distinction between formal moral principles, and sincerity is one of them, and material moral principles, which involve support and caring. And I'll put love among them. I think if somebody wants to equivocate on the word love and love you to death, that's not what I mean by love. And I think any value term that's very heavily laden in that way is subject to misprision. It can be pirated and taken over and made to mean something else. George Orwell was brilliant on that question, how you can make love mean hate and war mean peace and all sorts of things. And my daughter Allegra tells me that in Burma, where Orwell was originally a police officer, he's known today as the prophet. Because a lot of what he said they feel has come true. I could give you a whole nother talk on the subject of those misprisions, and particularly where a word or a concept is twisted and reversed and made to mean the opposite of what it did. Let me stick with this one. When those Phoenicians and those Carthaginians who came from Phoenicia sacrificed their children to Moloch and other deities, I don't think that they were doing anything insincere. I don't think that they were doing anything intentionally cruel. We have the textual evidence about what they did. They cared about their children. That's why they killed them. They were deeply pious individuals. And I'm saying we can be as pluralistic and as broad-minded as we like. That's the wrong idea of piety. All right? I'll leave it there.
One more.
One more. Is there one more? Yes, sir.
A couple of years ago, I was participating in a conference at Notre Dame, philosophical conference, on the character of the God of the Hebrew Bible.
Oh, they say nasty things.
And a philosopher started off by saying the God of the Hebrew Bible is a sadistic bastard.
Yes, yes.
Now, at least in the Bible, let's take a look at the book of Job and see what God does. And there's this.
You read the book of Job literally, do you?
No, I don't read it.
Well, be careful there,
Well,
because...
wait a minute.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say, let's take the story. And it says Kenan. God admits that what he did was Kenan. That is without cause or without purpose. Or let's turn to the book of Kohelet, and there we'll find a statement that God has placed ha'elim or ha'olam in the heart of human beings, and yet stacked the deck against them so that they cannot discover from first to last. Now, these are the kinds of things that are troubling biblical scholars today. The character of God as he is described in the Bible. Simple.
Okay.
Okay.
Nothing is as
How do
simple
you-
as we
how
might
do you
like
deal
to
with
be.
it?
I'll do my best. The book of Job, and I've written a book about just one interpretation of the book of Job.
I know your book.
You do? Did you? Okay. The book of Job is of course, an allegory. It's not a description of something that literally happened. It's an attempt, among one of the most beautiful attempts, to deal with the problem of evil. It's very poetic. It's very dramatic. It takes the form, in a way, of a dramatic dialogue, like the dialogues of Plato, and in a way, like an oratorio almost. The problem that it raises, and the reason it says Kenan, is because Job is not being punished for something. That's part of the premise of the book. The premise of the book is that he was a good man, and he didn't deserve what befell him. It was not coming to him. And it's meant to represent something that happens in the human condition. It's not a book about the characterization of the God of the Hebrew Bible as though the God of the Hebrew Bible were a character in a novel. It's a book about the human condition. And Job, very pointedly, is not represented as a Jew. I think there's a reason for that. The reason is that he's supposed to represent every man. He's supposed to represent what human beings are up against. And he's supposed to represent an extreme case of what human beings are up against.
And every man is not Tom. Every man cannot be Tom.
Not every man is perfect. Not every man is perfect. Not every man is upright. And as the book goes on, we find out that Job wasn't really perfect either. He had his little peccadillos, and like we all do. But nothing that would have justified what happened to him, and the book doesn't pretend that what happened to him was justified. That's part of the honesty and directness of that book. The book wants to work within the premise that whatever happens is at least permitted by God, and in some indirect way caused by God. That's a biblical premise, and all the books of the Bible share it. Within that premise, it wants to ask the question, which is asked in other forms in the Psalms, as you know, and other places. How could God allow something like that to happen? And the emphasis, of course, is on something like that. Because although Job was probably not a historical figure, things like that do happen. You know, we have the Boxing Day tsunami. It can't be that all the people who died in that terrible event deserve to die. We can't wrap that comforting thought around ourselves. And I think you and I would agree on
Well,
that.
sure. My only point was that there are many characteristics of God in the Bible that we should not emulate. And that's all
That's true. We don't, for example, emulate God's aseity. We don't emulate God's distance. We don't emulate God's silence. There are lots of features of God that we don't aspire to, and there's no reason why we should. But the problem that the book of Job is dealing with is not the problem of God as the perfect being
that we should emulate. The problem that the book of Job wants to bring to our attention is the problem of how could it be that a God who is a perfect being and does care and is generous would allow such terrible things to happen. And I'll give you a short answer to that, and I think it's the answer of the book of Job. But, answering the problem of evil, that goes beyond the lecture topic. The short answer that I would give you is that God's generosity involves the requirement that there should be nature. And nature has laws and means and interests of its own. The winds blow. Kant put it very nicely when he said, the condition of nature is freedom. That's the condition we live in, it's the condition we enjoy, it's the condition which allows us to pursue our self-transcendence, which was my big theme. But it also means the viruses are going to be viruses, and the winds are going to blow, and the rocks are going to fall, and the tsunamis are going to happen. Those things wouldn't be so terrible if it weren't for the fact that there was something good that was being harmed by them. That was my argument with Weinberg, you see, that he was presupposing what he was at the same time denying. I think, I heard a talk yesterday by a professor from Exeter who made the point that without viruses and bacteria, there wouldn't be much in the way of life at all. The eukaryotes and the multicellular organisms depend upon and came from that environment. Came from it and still depend on it. And they live inside us and way more than we do. That's what I think is meant to be intended by God's answer from the storm room. I don't think that God is bullying Job there, as is often said. I think that God is telling Job, making explicit what ought to be implicit, that we live in nature. Nature is not overtly hostile. Nature is not really indifferent either. But value is very localized. And the virus is after its goals, the same as you and I are after ours. Thank you.